Okay, histograms, very useful, very commonly used type of chart. First thing to know about histograms is when we use them. We use them when we're looking at a quantitative variable, so something that's interval or ratio. These would be times to use a histogram. What about categorical data? Let's take something like race. So this data set here has 6 different types of races coded with numbers 1 through 6. Could we create a histogram with this? The answer is technically no, not a meaningful histogram. What we could do, Google Sheets is not going to know that these numbers are not meaningful in the way that it wouldn't make sense to take an average of these, because you could just arbitrarily, we have 1 equals white, but we could have 1 equals Hispanic and 5 equals white. That's completely arbitrary. So what could happen here is if we try to do a histogram, we'll get something that looks like this. The fact that these little guys are kind of tiny compared to this, that's not an issue. We can make it look more like a typical histogram just by changing the bucket size to 1. Now it looks more like a typical histogram. However, it's still not really a histogram because we could switch these in order. A histogram, you're going to be able to see patterns from left to right. If we looked at a pattern here, we might say, well, it starts off really strong, dives down, goes low, a little bit higher, and all of this is completely meaningless because there's no rhyme or reason to why these different races are given these different numbers. Now you could have a chart like this. You could just call it a bar chart. You could also make a Pareto chart out of this by putting these in order of descending height, but it's not a meaningful histogram. Age, on the other hand, it's a ratio variable, so it's something that would be meaningful. Let's go ahead and insert a histogram for that one. Interesting choice there. We're going to put in a histogram, and we immediately get out a nice histogram. We could put some labels on this if we wanted to, but the question I want to tackle is how many different sometimes they're called intervals, classes, bars. How many of those should we use? So if we wanted to change the number of bars, we can go up to Customize, and we can go to Histogram. Here they call them buckets. So intervals, classes, buckets, these are all the same thing, just giving it different word. And the auto is Google Sheets, probably using one of the formulas from the textbook, Thomas Ryan's textbook, or something similar to that. But we can manually adjust that. Now if we basically put every age in its own category, so what that means is, for example, there's the age 9, here's the age 18, here's the age 19. Each year, each age gets its own bar, and that's too much. So what happens here is you start seeing patterns where there aren't really patterns at all. It looks like, oh, we have a spike right here, and then we have a valley, and it's probably because maybe a lot of people just had their birthday, their 50th birthday here, or this isn't necessarily meaningful patterns in the overall trend. On the other hand, if you have too many buckets, if you have too many of the values in a single bucket, so too few buckets, that's also not helpful. Here I guess you can see that we have slightly more people between the ages of 5 and 55 than we do between 55 and 100, but you really need more bars in order to see how this variable is distributed, to look for trends and patterns. So the best one is probably somewhere in between 1 and 50. And to get in there, a lot of it is just playing around. So here would be 5 years all put together. For example, this is the bucket between ages 5 and 9, 15 and 19, 20 and 24, and so on. And that's reasonably nice. You can see a few trends, like the majority of people answering here were between 50 and 75, so it was an older age group. You can see that there was up until this adult age, there was very few respondents. This was a phone survey in Pennsylvania. So you can see some trends there. If we change it to 10 perhaps, what's nice about this? One nice thing is it really brings out that normal distribution, especially between the ages of 15 and 95 here. We see the heart of the data. We still see that peak, people in between those ages, 50, 70, 75, whatever we said, that peak there. It's a little harder to see that the people between ages 15 and 18 did not respond very much to this survey. Here they're kind of tucked in this age group between 15 and 24. So you lose a little of that separation. And we can also, let's say we wanted more than this, but not quite as many as we had with 5. We can type something in arbitrarily there, like 7. Again, this gives us a nice sense of the overall shape. Kind of a normal distribution with a little more answering here in the people in their 20s or even early 30s than we would expect from, if you can kind of picture a normal distribution cutting through there. So we might interpret that as thinking, well, maybe more of them are home or responsive to phone calls, or whatever, don't have kids yet so they can afford to answer the phone. Whatever the case may be, it lets us see both the overall distribution and that little pocket. It also lets us see that this gap here below the age of 20, we're getting almost no one. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll just play around with the bucket size until I get what I think is the most informative. If there is a specific story I want to tell about, say, teenage response, then I'll make sure I get a setting that shows that. Now, this idea that you can tell anything you want through statistics, that's not quite true. I mean, you can certainly vary the story that you tell here depending on how many buckets you choose to use, but it's not like you can make this end really high and this end really high and the middle really low. I mean, notice that no matter what we put here, we're still getting this cluster of highest responses in the mid to late 50s, throughout their 60s, early 70s. I mean, unless you do something very unrealistic like this, which would just be a horrible histogram to begin with, you are getting that pocket there. So then it just becomes, what's the point of your article or what you're trying to say, and that lets you choose a little more clearly. As a general rule of thumb, what I often do for smaller data sets, I try to hit about 5 to 7 buckets, just because I think visually that's the easiest to understand. On a data set like this, where we have thousands of, I think 6,000 or so people, there's a little more room to see some of the different nuances of the data, and so that's why I might shoot for a few more buckets there. I think this was probably about my favorite, just because it shows clearly that you don't have those child responders. It shows clearly the overall normal distribution, but it also clearly shows that this age group in their 20s are responding more than expected by the distribution. So it's a back and forth trial and error.